On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, China and Russia joining hands for joint projects of all kinds amid global uncertainty.
中俄关系呈现更加积极的发展势头。
And Chinese President Xi Jinping met Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Can these estranged neighbors find some common ground? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show today in the Russian city of Vladivostok, where the 4th Eastern Economic Forum is underway. Chinese President Xi Jinping is among the high-level participants, and he has delivered a keynote speech there on Wednesday. The three-day event is expected to boost the trade and economic relations in the region. Before we get down to business and get a better understanding about what's going on between China and Russia, let's take a look at this.
While the annual Eastern Economic Forum is a platform aimed at driving investment in Russia's Far East, it is not limited to one region's development. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered keynote speeches on Wednesday. President Xi called on countries to forge partnerships in both Russia's Far East and Northeast Asia.
As one of the countries of Northeast Asia, China always seeks peaceful development. China has been working to create a friendly and harmonious environment for its neighbors. In a spirit of mutual respect, China has been playing a constructive role in promoting regional cooperation, putting each other's concerns into consideration, and promoting exchanges and dialogue between the countries in the region.
Development of the Far East is an absolute priority for us. I would like to repeat that this is a consistent long-term policy. Our efforts are aimed to create, here, in the dynamically growing Asia-Pacific region, a strong center for international cooperation and integration, business and investment activities, education, science and culture.
President Xi is the first Chinese leader to attend the event. The forum marks his third meeting this year with his Russian counterpart. Multiple agreements have been signed. These include China's media group and Russia's Rossiya Segodnya news agency entering strategic cooperation, and Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba and Russian technology group Mail.ru launching a joint venture. The cooperation between China and Russia's Far East region has produced concrete results in recent years, as China has become the largest trading partner and a source of imports for the area. More than 60 countries, including Japan, South Korea, Mongolia, are attending this year's forum, and Northeast Asia is an area ripe for connectivity.
For more discussion on the Eastern Economic Forum and the relations, the latest development between China and Russia, we are joined in our Beijing studio Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business here in Beijing. In Moscow, we have Professor Alexander Lukin, Director of East Asian and SCO Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Also joining us in Moscow from Russia, Viktor Olevich. He is a political analyst and also lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Let me go to you first, Professor Lukin. What do you make of the really warm, apparently, relations between China and Russia? After all, 3 meetings already this year between the heads of states. What does it say? Is it just between the two countries or sending signals to the others? Professor Lukin.
Well, the improvement and normalization of Russian-Chinese relations and then virtual rapprochement began long ago, more than 2 decades ago. And despite the fact that leaders changed and even in Russia social system changed, the improvement and coming together between Russia and China has not changed, which means it's an objective political process. But of course, at that moment, the United States very much helps us to come together, because it began, especially under Trump, pressing both Russia and China at the same time. And it, of course, makes the necessity of coordination even more important. This is kind of the geopolitical basis for it. But I think that the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping came to Vladivostok is important not only because of that, but because he probably wanted to stress that China can contribute to the development of the Russian Far East. And this is a strategically important goal of Russian policy.
Is the United States apparently, Professor Liu from Beijing, pushing China and Russia ever much closer toward one another? Russia is under sanction coming from the so-called Western countries, and China certainly in an apparent trade war with the United States, likely to be more escalations.
Yes. You know, during the national security strategy crafted under the Trump administration, China and Russia are named as revisionist countries, adversaries to the United States. So we normally say nothing unites but a common enemy. So now there is a strong impetus for China and Russia to work together. And aside from that, there is really intrinsic rationale for China and Russia to work together, given the structural complementarity in its economy, and also given the strong ambition of the two state leaders to renovate and also innovate its national economy and to create themselves as the greatest countries.
See, Mr. Olovich, of course, it was the United States earlier in its strategic papers talking about China and Russia as their so-called big nation competitors, and named China and Russia in a very negative way in many of the policy papers. But the question is whether China and Russia want to really go onto that road, which has been, in a way, designed by the United States.
Well, we can look at the way that the Russian-Chinese relations have been developing since the end of the Cold War. And as my colleague had said, the rapprochement began in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union. And then the relationship was cemented further when the United States became the sole superpower after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the situation in the unipolar world, where Washington saw an opportunity to dictate its will on everyone else, both Moscow and Beijing saw themselves as the victimized parties, as the less influential parties that could increase their influence in international relations by increasing cooperation, both political cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, and especially and also economic cooperation, which is what we are seeing today. It is not accidental that the importance of the Vladivostok Economic Forum increased. In fact, it was instituted 4 years ago, when the major economic sanctions against Russia were initiated by Washington and its Western allies.
Well, but
of course, Russia at that time.
But Mr. Elovich, you know, there is a huge difference between the way that China and Russia act now in order to quote-unquote balance with quote-unquote compete against. So my question to you is exactly what China and Russia, if put together or if talked about separately, they're to balance that of the United States or to compete against the United States, which has been the latter one, the description coming from the U.S. originally in their policy papers, terming China and Russia as the so-called big nation competitors.
Of course, for the American foreign policy establishment, which is used to having a leading role in international relations for the past quarter century, both Russia and China and some other powers like Iran are seen as geopolitical competitors. But in Moscow and in Beijing, we see it as a balancing act, essentially as an act in transition from Pax Americana, from the unipolar American world, to a multipolar world, where it will not just Washington will play a part in constructing the architecture of future international relations, of the future international system, but also Beijing and Moscow and other capitals of world powers will play a role in constructing that political, economic, and other aspects of our common future.
Oh, say,
and,
Mr. Putin, Mr. Lukin, may I ask Professor Mr. Lukin, can you help us to understand if it is an act in transition? It is real, actual economic and social bounds that have put these countries together? Will the economic and real interactions really catch up with the political, in a way, common ground? That actually has been a question being asked for a long time between China and Russia and about the potential of this relationship. Professor Lukin.
Well, both. But first I want to say that I don't entirely agree with another colleague who said that we are uniting against an enemy. I would call the current situation as unilateral Cold War. It's the United States who sees us as enemy, both China and Russia. We don't see the United States as enemy. In Russia, we see the United States as kind of a country that has gone crazy. You know, it's run by a delusional elite. But we wish them well. We wish the American people to have a better government. It's a bit like situation during the Soviet Union, but we changed places. America is an ideologically run country, and we are very pragmatic. So from that point of view, when we are talking about Russian-Chinese relations, I would say that at the beginning the main reason for our cooperation was more geopolitical than economic. For example, American trade with China is like 7 or 8 times larger than China's trade with Russia. Also, China is the first Russia's partner, trading partner. But then it came to economic necessity as well, and the United States helped us a lot. For example, just a few days ago, China announced that as a countermeasure against American measures, it's not going to buy American soybeans. And Russia has soybeans. And one of the questions that is discussed at the forum, Vladivostok Forum now, is that China is going to invest into the soybeans programs, agricultural development in the Russian Far East. So, you know that the United States itself is moving Russia and China closer together, not only politically, but also economically.
Okay, Professor Liu, let me ask you about that, about this economic incentive in a way put forward by Washington to make China and Russia come ever closer. We understand 1,000-strong business delegation is accompanying the Chinese President Xi Jinping to this forum, and enormous amount of contracts have been signed. We see, Professor Liu, there are several platforms that Russia and China have been working on together. Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is one of them, while Russia is having its own version, which is so-called the Far East, as they say, to develop the Far East. So how do you see the real underground projects really taking place? There has been concern whether those have been talked about will really be implemented, and whether those implemented will eventually see the final result. Those have been questions being raised about economic relations between China and Russia for some years. So, Professor Liu, is this time going to be different?
Well, for the last 2 decades, both of those leaders have demonstrated a great vision that where there is good reason that we can work together, but so far it is still the gas and oil that plays the most important role in China-Russia trade. And now situation is getting different with deepened globalization and also deepened regional integration. More and more of the Chinese businesses, aside from those gigantic state-owned firms, the private firms, particularly in terms of the electronics, the manufacturing, machine tools, are really riveting the Russia as an important marketplace and supported by the e-commerce. And now we see that more and more Chinese investors are really highly interested in developing the agricultural programs in the Far East. And now there are serious plans to move on that.
I see.
But what they really desire would be a better consistency of the policy from Russia, and also rule of law and even dispute settlement mechanism can be in place so that they have better assurance of what they can really achieve along the way.
Mr. Olovich, of course, some of those points mentioned by Professor Liu from Beijing is very important to the Chinese investors.
Well, of course, the Russian Far East, which is one of the most problematic regions in Russia from an economic standpoint, is an area of great interest for the Chinese business, for Chinese industrial managers, leaders. And in this way, Russia offers also a market for Chinese goods, and also there is a good perspective for cooperation on significant projects in the transportation sphere, and not just, by the way, not just in the Far East. There is still a discussion on the construction of a high-speed railway in the European part of Russia, in the Urals, where China is set to become a significant investor. And there are other projects in the energy sphere, of course, which is very important, both to Russia as an exporter of energy goods and for China as a major importer. And there are projects also in agriculture and in fishing, in other areas of common interest, both for Moscow and for Beijing. I also want to stress that the economic forum, the current economic forum in Vladivostok this year, has more participants than the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which usually was more important. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was more focused on the West, more focused on Europe, on relations with Russia's partners to the West. But today, and in the last 4 years, Russia has made a sustained effort to gain access to improve relations, economic relations, with its eastern neighbors, China, South Korea, Mongolia, Japan, Vietnam, nations in Southeast Asia. And what we are seeing today in Vladivostok
and of course, we have seen quite some
success.
interactions. I have to talk over you in order to introduce the next piece for our audience to see. The development of the Far East region of Russia has been a key issue for this year's forum. Russia has been pushing for, as our guests mentioned earlier many times, Far East development for years, and China has been actively taking part in some of those developments. So far, China is the largest foreign investor in the Far East region. 28 projects covering multiple areas are in progress. Total investment reached nearly $4 billion. So you can see some of those numbers over there, as mentioned by our guests earlier. But Professor Liu, one thing is very important. That is whether this forum or that forum, of course, it's Russia government's motivation to promote a more Russian economy and interaction with the rest of the world. But also important is the sustainability of this kind of cooperation, the real implementation of these kind of cooperation, and also the mutual benefits of this kind of cooperation? Professor Liu, very briefly.
Yes, I think now the reality is there that there is high complementarity between these two economies, and also more of the Chinese investors are ready with money, with skill, and now the Russia, when the economy is getting more on the upward movement, and when they are shifting to the Far East, so that's a huge opportunity, and also China is also ready to work with other countries like South Korea, like the Japan, etc., to further develop there. Again, I should say the most important consideration is still the policy consistency and rule of law.
Right. If you take a look at the screen, you will notice in a moment that the numbers between China and Russia when it comes to bilateral trade is certainly getting ever more impressive. If we could play those numbers for our audience right now. But on the other hand, Professor Lukin, what about China and Russia interacting with the other players in the region? Will this region be one of those most active ones when it comes to economic incentives and the economic engines? That is still a big question mark.
Well, Russia is developing relations with other countries, especially economic relations with other countries of the region. You know that President Putin has rather close relations with Japanese Prime Minister Abe, and they are talking about, just today they were talking about the possibility of signing a peace treaty, and Russia is cooperating with South Korea very closely. It's cooperating with China and South Korea on the Korean nuclear issue, but South Korea is also a large investor in the Russian Far East. Actually, President Putin is very active in organizing the Vladivostok Forum, and we expected Chinese leader to come there earlier. Of course, they meet with President Putin on many occasions every year, like 5 or 6 times.
Right.
But before this year, Mr. Abe came twice to this forum. I think South Korean leaders came. So some of our skeptical observers asked several times, so where is your good friend China? So we're very happy to see Mr. Xi Jinping this time, or Chairman Xi Jinping this time in Vladivostok. China is also developing relations with neighboring countries, but I think it should probably do more, because if China has some problems with neighboring countries like India, some countries of ASEAN, territorial issues, until these issues are solved, like China managed to solve it with Russia.
All right.
Until that time, the United States is going to use such conflicts in their favor.
Okay,
so
well,
I think
we have to give the Chinese guests a chance to talk as well. Professor Liu, before we go, very briefly, final comments, response to your colleagues from Russia, 2 of them.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly the Belt and Road program is a starting point for a new height in the collaboration, and was not only in agriculture, border trade, but also high-tech development. There can be a lot of promise that can really unfold for the regional integration, not only between these 2 countries, but also for the entire region.
Now, to mention the forum, there's also the joint military exercise, one of the largest of its kind since the 1980s, going on between Russia, China, and Mongolia. Of course, tomorrow we're going to discuss exactly what is happening over there and what does it mean for these countries and these regions. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for today. Mr. Victor Olevich, Mr. Alexander Lukin, and Professor Liu Baocheng. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Can these estranged neighbors find really some common ground? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on the sidelines of the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. The two countries are working to improve once strained ties. Xi said the world's two major economies should take responsibility for global peace and prosperity and to protect the multilateralism and trade rules under the WTO. Xi welcomed Tokyo's involvement in Beijing's opening up and reform, encouraging Japan to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Abe said Japan wants closer bonds with China as its neighbor's development in recent decades has had a good impact on Japan. He promised Tokyo would properly handle sensitive issues regarding Taiwan and World War II history. For more discussion about the China-Japan ties, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. In London, we have Mr. Angus Lockyer, who is a lecturer in the history of Japan at SOAS, University of London. And also in Washington, D.C., joining us, Douglas Paul, Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gentlemen, welcome, the three of you, to our program. Mr. Paul, I want you to maybe help us to understand, as someone, as an observer coming from the U.S., how do you see this relationship between China and Japan, in fact, is really warming up?
Well, I wouldn't say it was warming up. I think it's a matter of acknowledging realism. Japan and China have many conflicting interests, and they have a few overlapping interests. But they have one unavoidable reality, and that is they are neighbors. They're going to be bumping against each other in the waters on their historical issues between the two for a long time to come. And I think what Mr. Abe is trying to do as Prime Minister is continue to stand firmly for Japanese interests that might be in conflict with China, but to find areas where, if possible, they can manage that conflict and seek areas of cooperation.
Mr. Lockyer, what about your observation that China and Japan, recent years, really have been having some problems? Interactions, particularly at the very top level, has been rare. And now things is really changing?
Again, like your previous speaker, I'd say really changing is a little bit strong, but certainly the international environment has changed to the extent that the pivot of the rules-based order, which we've all lived under for so long, is becoming a bit unsteady, and that's in DC. To the extent that that's happening, of course, both China and Japan realize that maybe they have to exert themselves a little more to ensure that there's a certain degree of stability within the region within which they can, as the previous speaker said, rub up against each other. Sometimes in competition, and certainly the historical issues won't go away overnight. And certainly there is also going to be economic competition, since China has made such great strides. But there are also areas of possible collaboration, and I think there's a degree of pragmatism here about acknowledging that.
About that pragmatism, Mr. Rong, we see China now, as we mentioned earlier, many times, in an apparent trade war with the United States. It is very likely that the U.S. would move on also to Tokyo. But at the same time, we also see Tokyo is certainly having its very clear economic ideology by promoting and believing in TPP and many other multilateral platforms, as well as free trade. So will this, in a way, economic and trade ideology bring China and Japan onto the same platform and be able to cooperate with one another?
Well, I'm not totally sure that that trade issue will bring China and Japan in a sort of way that would be able to do something. But I do believe that the past few years, in particular since late last year, the relationship has seen positive and interactions from the two sides. And I think at the meeting, both President Xi and Prime Minister Abe had made very clear the relationship as now back to the track, and they are working together to make sure that the pragmatic cooperation will continue and new areas can be explored, and they also understand that they have to work together to manage their differences in a constructive way. So I see that there are big changes in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of attitude, and more importantly, I think the positive way that the two sides are working together to ensure there will be a better and a stable relationship.
I see. All of you have been using the word pragmatism. About that word, Mr. Paul, also about geopolitics in the region. I mean, Northeast Asia, in which Japan and China certainly are two big parties in the region, have been experiencing some issues, for example, about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Well, the allies of the United States, such as Japan, is wondering what is likely to be the real nature of relationship between Washington and Tokyo. How will China and Japan moving closer with one another on some of these very important geopolitical issues in the region? Is there a possibility?
I think there's a narrow band of potential cooperation on these bigger issues. Fundamentally, the nuclear issue is going to be between North Korea and the United States. I think China wants to see denuclearization, but it has a different set of priorities about the long-term strategic picture than what Japan has. Japan, I think, is concerned that the Korean Peninsula not be in the end dominated by Chinese influence, and wants to exercise a separate kind of influence there. Again, one that's very burdened by the history of Japan's colonialism on the Korean Peninsula. And so Japan's got a particularly delicate dance to perform to maintain the kind of balance of power in the region that suits Japanese interests, while still finding areas to reduce competition or promote cooperation with China. You were mentioning trade earlier. I think the U.S. threat to the trade supply chain in East Asia is one that directly affects the interests of both Beijing and Tokyo.
That's right.
And Mr. Abe has to get in there and defend the interests of Japanese suppliers to that supply chain.
Agree, Mr. Rong from Beijing?
Well, I think on the regional issues like North Korea's nuclear issues, certainly China and Japan shares a common ground, that is the denuclearization. And of course, I think being the ally of the United States, Japan has its own sort of interest and own concerns. But all in all, I think this is the starting point of the cooperation and coordination between China and certainly the United States also, and Japan. So I think it is also, at least from this meeting, I mean, there are signals that, as I said, that they are going to approach these issues in a more positive and constructive way.
We have seen, Mr. Lockyer, several interactions between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abe from Japan on multilateral platforms. But it's very likely, now we know, in October, Prime Minister Abe is going to make a visit to China. That is going to be bilateral, certainly, and both sides are actively preparing for it. Some would say, wow, that's quite quick in a way. What would they mean if it really takes place? Does it mean that the ice is really melting, which has been growing there for quite some years between China and Japan, Mr. Lockyer?
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's the next step along the way. I think high-level meetings, bilateral meetings, as you point out, are enormously important, both in the symbolic and the material sense. I mean, the symbolic meaning of the meeting will be big. The reason being, of course, that it's the 40th anniversary of a very important treaty between the two sides. But I think at the same time, that meeting allows other things to happen. I mean, we've heard of earlier today about possible collaborations on the Belt and Road Initiative, specifically in concrete projects. And I think those kind of steps gradually do change the landscape within which both sides are operating. So it's a positive step. What will happen, as a historian, I have to say we don't know. But it's a good step.
There are even things that the historians wouldn't know. Well, there we go. About the BRI, for example. That, of course, has never been touched on much by Japan earlier, but this time it's different. China, on the other hand, was quite far away from the idea of TPP earlier, but then China's idea and attitude has been gradually evolving. So it seems that no matter what it's called, it seems that both sides are looking for multilateral kinds of cooperation about trade, about economic development. That is for sure, Mr. Rong. Will that common ground be well used by both sides and smartly used by both sides?
It is true. I think on the regional issues, particularly on these regional economic, so the trade integration and the issue, seems that China and Japan has now coming closer. And particularly on the question of Belt and Road Initiative, I think Japan did have changed, to the extent that it's now more sort of in a way that is more would like to be part of that. And of course, from Chinese perspective, it is very clear this is an international, is a platform international cooperation, and would like to welcome Japan to join that. By the way, I think the Japanese business community has always been there. Very much sort of keen, and that is in the visit, last visit in May, Premier Li Keqiang, and this was the first, by the way, important visit by Chinese Premier in 8 years, and then an agreement was reached that the two sides work together at the so-called third-party cooperation, infrastructure building. And a mechanism has been established, and then they are now continue to work on it. President Xi, during the meeting, made it very clear it could become a kind of a new area and a testing ground for deepening China and Japan practical cooperation. So there's a lot of hope and also concrete work that has been done.
Well, a lot of hope. I love that word, but of course we cannot leave our future based only on hope, as we know. But Mr. Paul, therefore, you talked earlier about the global supply chain. That is extremely important. If you look at China and Japan, the second and the third largest economies in the world, if they work together about something new or try to create an alternative different from the U.S. approach, that's going to be very interesting. If you look at Japan, really has got some of the latest technological advantages over most of the economies. China, of course, the largest marketplace, and also application of technologies. We all know innovation is the key these days. So what does it mean if these two countries are really put together, at least on some areas?
Well, I think that as China's economy moves up the ladder of technology, and you address the question of reduced availability of cheap labor in China by increased industrialization and sophistication, there's going to be more harmonies with Japanese capabilities in time. This has to apply, as we were discussing earlier, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership concept. China was really not ready to be part of it when it was first introduced years ago, but over the time that's passed in between, China is much more interested in the kinds of rules that will protect technology, will create markets, and will allow China to be able to get its more sophisticated products the kind of return on investment that you need to maintain and grow China's prosperity. So their interests are coming together in time. There are also differences. I mean, the Japanese have very precious technologies they've developed, and they want to protect those from forced transfer through various kinds of joint ventures and other rules inside the Chinese market. So there will be tensions over access to Japanese technology, and you may find that Japan, the U.S., and Europe are going to be more of a common force in insisting that China respect the rules of protecting those technologies and not simply appropriating them if China wants to be part of a broader trade program that has more benefit to the Chinese producers and consumers.
Right. Before we go, one final question, of course, is the elephant in the room. That is the history. China-Japan has been having some rocky history about their histories. Therefore, Mr. Lockyer, do you think Japan, even if the Prime Minister promised to a certain extent, will be able to do it well, at least to the satisfaction of to its neighbors, like China, like South Korea this time?
It is the elephant in the room, as you've said. It's not unique, of course. The region as a whole has a whole set of history issues which are not simply unilateral or restricted to Japan. And indeed, the world more generally, apart from perhaps Germany, has had a very difficult time coming to terms with the history of the 20th century. I think as generations pass, as younger scholars work on these issues, as scholars between different countries work on these issues, which they have been doing, the conversation shifts. Again, it takes time. There are emotions in play here, which you can't discount. I'm optimistic here, but one has to be careful, and one has to do what I think is beginning to happen, which is begin to understand the issue from the other side. That's difficult work, which will take time. But let's hope, back to that word, let's hope that as time passes, we can have conversations.
Oh, you're using the word hope as well. Well, shall we have Mr. Rong before we go? Final words from you, 30 seconds if you can, sir.
Yeah, I think history, is one of the sensitive issues for the relationship between China and Japan, and also Japan with the other neighbors in the region. I think China's position on history is very clear. That is, history is kind of mirror, and with that also take a look ahead to the future. And it is also the principles in the four political documents. And I think that at this meeting, Prime Minister Abe has made clear they will uphold to these principles, and there will be no change to that. So we hope that Japan will keep the promise.
All right.
That hope is not an issue anymore.
Hope. Those are the words that three of you all shared. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Rong Ying and Angus Lockyer and Douglas Paul. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us online or check out our social media platforms. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the whole team. Thanks for watching, and see you later.